Leijiverse. Welcome. You're listening to the voice of free Arcadia. My name's Captain Hardluck, and I am so excited to introduce you all to our new podcast, really the first Leijiverse podcast that I know of, and I've had such an awesome time building this community. We've got the world's largest English-speaking Leiji Matsumoto community on Earth, as far as I know. This is going to be a whole new facet for us to reach out and really deep dive into some different topics and get a lot of different opinions on these matters. We're going to be looking at specific movies and anime series, and we're going to be taking a look at specific characters and symbolism, and maybe even do some other fun things along the way. So I'd like to introduce our host and guest host. Firstly, our host who will be joining us on every one of these. This is Chad. Chad, introduce yourself to the people.
Hey, my name's Chad, obviously. I run the Captain Harlock and the Arcadia meme page. Nothing serious. I just like to make people laugh, so...
We've got our comic relief on deck. Go check out Captain Harlock and the Arcadia. I share a few of their memes every once in a while. Good stuff. And Julien Pirou, who's been so amazingly kind to offer to join us on a somewhat regular basis here, will be very frequent with us. Julien Pirou, introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name is Julien. I'm the webmaster of a French site called Triple Nine, which I started 17 years ago. Time flies. And yeah, I've been a long time fan of Leiji Matsumoto. I worked for a while for a publisher called Kaze in France, doing some DVD releases of Matsumoto's work. I did the graphic design for, I don't know if you see it, Space Symphony Medal. So I'm very proud of that. As a fan, it was really like a dream project. And since then, I've been I wrote the preface for a couple of releases of manga, Matsumoto's mangas in France. And I hosted a conference with Matsumoto a couple of years ago at Japan Expo. I have my Leijiverse street credibility pretty high, I guess.
Yeah, your CV is on point, and I'm so thankful to have you on board as such an excellent source of information for us. And you've been so kind today. You've selected the topic for our very first episode. I think it's a fantastic one. The many faces of Captain Harlock, or just Harlock in general, who has taken so many different forms, not just as space pirate, but cowboy, outlaw, World War II, fighter pilot. I mean, and we're going to get into every single one of them as deep as we can here. Julien, it will be Sherpa-ing us through this discussion. So again, so very thankful to have them on board. Take it away, Julien.
Okay, so yeah, it's very basically when you asked me for suggestions about what the first episode could be about, for me it was pretty obvious because Captain Harlock is, I think, really the face of the Leijiverse, at least in the West.
Undoubtedly I would say he's the most recognizable character worldwide from Leiji Matsumoto.
I think probably Metal is the second one. But in the West, I think really Captain Harlock is the one people know best. And there have been references to him and parodies of him and homages to him in places you would not expect, like Star Wars comics and stuff. And it's really, I think, a pillar of the Leijiverse. It's a character that Matsumoto describes him as, he feels of him like his own child in a way. So I think it's a character that's been constantly reinvented. He appeared in some form already when Matsumoto was a child. And since then he has been reinventing him, trying to find places for him a bit everywhere, really. And it's pretty amazing because I don't see any other example of a character that's been in one body of work, the hero, the anti-hero, the villain, the supporting character, in completely different roles. in completely different eras. And in a way, it's, for me, I always felt that Leiji Matsumoto and Michael Moorcock should meet and speak to each other at some point, because Harlock is a bit of the eternal champion of Matsumoto.
Wait, you and Chad seem to know what you're talking about. Chad, what is he talking about? Fill me in.
So the whole idea of the eternal champion is, he's well versed. He has kind of the same personality types that just kind of reincarnate over and over again, and all these different what's the right term? Like we were saying, heroes, champions. Yeah. And so you'll find these traits over and over again. And that's kind of the whole Michael Moorcock basis that he'd describe heroes as. Okay,
so this is almost like a Joseph Campbell sort of work on the hero itself, sort of analysis of. Okay, right over my head. I'm so.
In fact, Moorcock, when you look at it's a bit of a side topic, but you take Matsumoto, you take Moorcock, and you see an obsession with time and the cycle of time, an obsession with World War II and the trauma of having lived through. For Moorcock, it was a blitz in London. From Leiji, it was obviously he was a child during World War II in Japan, and you see how this. I think if they were ever to meet, there would be an amazing conversation, and I would want to be there to hear them talk, because they would have so much to talk about. And actually, Matsumoto did the artwork for a Japanese edition of Moorcock novel, not the most famous one. It was he's a warlord of Mars. John Carter spoof. Unfortunately, not the best material for their similarities to come forth, but still, that's a meeting I'd love to see.
Yeah. And talking about, how he came up with Harlock, and it's interesting that you say, Harlock became Matsumoto's child, but there's a lot of Matsumoto's father in Harlock. Would you agree with that, Julien?
It's an interesting question, because I don't think Matsumoto himself mentioned that his father was an inspiration for Harlock. But I think there is a clear similarity in the fact that his father was a squadron leader in World War II. So he was a pilot. He had men under his command. He was a very responsible figure. Really, as Matsumoto tells it, was very at the weight of going back home, knowing that so many young people under his watch had died on the battlefield. And,
I mean, he sent them himself, right? That was his duty, to send kamikaze pilots to their, untimely fate.
And so that's a lot of that inspired the Battlefield manga and the Cockpit series. But for Harlock, Matsumoto usually mentions a childhood friend of his being the main inspiration, and actually for the Harlock Toshiro dynamic, because Matsumoto says that he had this friend that was a tall, handsome guy, where Matsumoto was a short, nerdy type, and he said so he was super popular with the ladies and so on, but we completed each other, so together we were invincible, basically. And he said, and basically Harlock came from this character, and what's interesting is that Matsumoto mentions he told this story in interviews a lot of times, but when he was a child, he was going home from school, and he had this sort of sing-along kind of rhythm where he would say Aroku, Aroku. It wasn't meant to mean anything, but he started to use it. He mentioned that he used it as a sort of pirate battle cry, like pirates going Aroku. And I could not find this actual occurrence in one of the published manga, but when Matsumoto was a child, he drew tons of stuff that was never published anywhere. So I don't doubt it exists somewhere.
Sure.
But and it's much later when he was living in Tokyo and already a professional manga artist that at some point, as he tells it, he takes a newspaper and there's a story saying that a German man was hit by a car in the street, and the man is named Harlock. And suddenly Matsumoto said, "Whoa, that's a real name." Actually, this word I thought I made up in Germany, that's a name. And from this point on, that becomes a character name that he uses from many different characters before it evolves, and in a way it crystallizes into the Harlock that we know and love, and the space pirate captain. But it took a while before Harlock came from a sort of generic names that Matsumoto was using for a variety of characters in a variety of contexts to become a sort of spotlight stealing character. One of the earliest manga from Matsumoto that is available because it has been republished is what is in Bokenki. So it's like an adventure chronicle, basically. And it's story of pirate. It's really inspired by Tezuka's New Treasure Island.
Okay.
And in that story, there's a heroic pirate character with a pirate who hunts evil pirates. And this character, he really looks like Errol Flynn. He looks nothing like the Harlock we know, but he's called Captain Kingston. And,
okay.
Kingston was a port in Jamaica and so on. So it's a pirate inspired name. And his flag is a flag that we know and that we two of us wear as a t-shirt today. So you can already see like the seed of this character. And Matsumoto himself says that for me that's the first Harlock. He wasn't called Harlock yet, but that's the sort of starting point that became this heroic pirate captain later.
Well, there are, Matsumoto has a lot of stories, and he tells a lot of stories, and his stories have changed over time. So we always have to take Matsumoto's own word with a grain of salt, I think. I think we could all agree with that. Just doing some basic research here, there's a military song called The Men of Harlock, which looks to be German. Welsh. Actually Welsh. So that's a military song there that's from the mid 1400s, which is interesting. Just some basic research there. And there's also a German author who has the name Harlock. So, when I always hear that story about him just saying Harlocku, Harlock, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he did like serendipitously it comes to him, but that there are alternate possibilities which could be considered, but I won't dive too deep into that. But I do want to backtrack to the idea of Harlock as Matsumoto's father. And another really defining thing for me in that sort of headcanon is the fact that Harlock is rejecting the government position that he had in going from in my youth in Arcadia as a pilot, and he's given the opportunity once his forces are defeated, similarly to how the Japanese forces were defeated by the U.S. forces in World War II, followed by an occupation where Matsumoto's father was offered more work as a pilot, which he turned down, which I believe is commonly, that gave Matsumoto a really strong ethical, moral grounds. And you can really see that in the Harlock character being offered the position of pilot for the Illumidas in my youth in Arcadia and rejecting it and finding his own fleet to fly. So for me, that's where, I hear what Matsumoto is saying, but he does love to tell stories. And I think that he hasn't ever been very public about his father, from my knowledge. I don't know if he's spoken on him in too great of length beyond some references there. And we had Wacha on, who is also part of the Tokinawa fan community in France, as you are. and really broke down, dug up a lot of information about Matsumoto's father and being trained by French air pilots who were selling planes to the Japanese, which later did not fare well for the Allied forces. But I digress. Another facet to consider.
And you're right, because as I say, Matsumoto, when he speaks about his father, and he talks about him quite a bit, actually, but usually in relation to the Battlefield manga. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Arcadia of my youth movie was made up from various stories, including stories from the Cockpit. So I think there's a strong relation between Arcadia of my youth, the Cockpit, and Matsumoto father that you don't necessarily see in other works featuring the character.
So I think, Chad, do you have anything to add to the origins of Captain Harlock? Any thoughts, feelings on the matter?
When it comes to the origins, I was actually talking to you about this yesterday, about Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He's a pirate that hunts, evil sailors. He kind of designates things on his own morality spectrum, but, he really goes after imperialists, that would impose their ideas and their laws on other people. Mm-hmm. And you sent me that article that said that there was a lot of inspiration from Jules Verne's works on the Japanese people for that purpose.
Yeah, one of the first works of sci-fi to reach Japan in a translated form.
And I also thought it was amusing that, Captain Nemo, he has a designated island that he happens to travel to pretty regularly, and that's kind of like Death Shadow Island, isn't it?
Yeah. The branded SSX in that version, and many incarnations of that pirate island, yes.
And actually, years ago, I wrote an article about the parallel between Nemo and Harlock for one of the Tokinowa's web-ring sites called L'Univers de Yamato. So a Yamato-focused website. But there's a lot of parallels you can see, and even in like the creeds of the both characters. I mean, Captain Harlock has this sort of leitmotif, like going, "My name is Harlock and I live free in the sea of stars," blah, blah, blah. I don't know how it's translated in English. But it's repeated a lot in the manga, in the anime. They made that a sort of pirate songs, and you can hear in several episodes. And Nemo has a few moments like that when he takes his flag, which is a black flag with a golden N on it, and he plants it on the South Pole and stuff like that, and he makes all these speeches saying like, "Sea is the realm of real freedom," and you can really see that there are kindred spirits. They would probably get along very well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Captain Kingston in Boken Key was in 1953. So Matsumoto is very young at the time. He's 15. And when you read it, it's really a child's imagination at work. I mean, tons of crazy stuff happens, and he puts some characters and forgets about them 2 pages later. And but it's fine for a young kid drawing his own manga. It's perfectly fine. The first character really named Harlock that I could find, and maybe there's people listening to us who actually know a bit more and know other examples, is a story called Tomi in Waxay. So it's the hibernation planet. It's from 1968, sorry. And so that's when Matsumoto is starting to go into this sci-fi. He's been working in shoujo manga for like a decade or so. And now he has the opportunity to go and do some sci-fi adult boy manga. And he does this story called Tomi no Waxay. And here you have basically everything already in some form. You have 2 main characters. So one is a tall, handsome guy with one eye. He doesn't have like a
eye patch.
Eye patch, but he has the hair falling in front of his eye, and he's called Phantom Harlock. And so that's basically Phantom Harlock first.
Phantom F. Harlock from My Youth in Arcadia.
Yeah, there's no F yet, but it's Phantom Harlock. So that starts here. And he's traveling in space with his best friend, who is a Japanese guy with glasses, and he's not called Oyama, he's a guy called Mori. But again, another surname that Matsumoto uses a lot, Mori.
Yeah.
And then they arrive on a strange planet when they meet a strange woman, and so that's Matsumoto 101. Basically.
Yeah.
And as far as I could find, that's really the earliest appearance of Harlock as a character designated by that name. He's not yet a pirate, but he's a space adventurer with his best friend, and so so I guess a lot of what Matsumoto describes as this dynamic between himself and his best friend, and it's already there. So so I would be on the side of saying that is probably a true statement that he's giving when he's telling that story. But indeed, Matsumoto is a storyteller, so he tends to turn things into big stories. And a few months later, he reuses this name, but for a villain in Kosoku Esper. So that's
Lightspeed Esper?
Lightspeed Esper, exactly.
Yes.
So that's a character that's a very interesting story as well, because he was a mascot for Toshiba, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, sir.
Who was created by another artist.
Yeah.
That artist at some point wanted to stop doing this manga, and Matsumoto saw an opportunity to say, okay, they're looking for someone to take over this character, so hey, I'm Leiji Matsumoto, I want to draw boy manga, shonen, I will do this. And then very soon he takes over, and it becomes Matsumoto thing. Probably today the character is best known for being a Leiji Matsumoto manga at some point. And in one of the stories, Esper has to fight a villain called Dr. Harlock, who is a very brainiac kind of villain, very, very evil. So we can see that at this time, Matsumoto has not yet said, okay, so Harlock is always going to be a hero. It's more like, I like this name and I will use it if it sounds cool in a story, basically.
Yeah, and even some of we'll see as we go along, some of the faces of Harlock are still, if not completely evil, tinged with some definite darkness, and we'll definitely run into that. And another interesting thing about Lightspeed Esper, not to go too deep into it, is that Toshiba original mascot was drawn so similarly to Astro Boy in the classic Tezuka style, which Matsumoto himself used. And it's interesting to see how Matsumoto sort of almost rejected that style and threw down, even though he had been a proprietor of that style for so long, and threw down this very long, lanky character that would, become his sort of design style. Long, lanky, fluid line art, sort of. I always call it manga nouveau or something like that. It's very, very French, the way he draws his characters, in my opinion. But I could be wrong. You're French, so maybe you know better than me.
But in fact, it was a time, especially this particular year, so 68. It's a time where Matsumoto really tries to shed away his old style, and in a way move into a more adult style.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to draw shoujo anymore. He doesn't want to draw like Tezuka. He loves Tezuka and admires Tezuka, but But that's a point in his career when he say, I need to become my own artist in a way.
Absolutely.
And so he will look away from what is being done in Japan. And he will, he tells this in interviews that were translated on a website, which I salute, which is ourStarblazers.com.
Yes.
And,
Tim Eldred.
Tim Eldred's site.
Been a guest on here.
And he made teams on his site translated or got translated some old interviews that Matsumoto did like back in the 70s when it was like fresh. So you don't have too much embellishment yet. And he says actually, I was looking for new ideas how to draw, and I came up on this bookstore that was importing stuff from Europe and the US, and I found Barbarella, which was a Jean-Claude Forest, so a French artist character, very popular in the 60s, and there was a movie with Jane Fonda and so on. Yes. And he talks about Vampirella as well.
Okay.
And he says, so there was this amazing art, completely different from what I was used to see, and that opened my horizons in terms of how I could draw some characters.
Yeah.
You really see this evolution at this time when he, especially in Sexaroid, which is really like his first big hit as a sci-fi adult manga, and it's really, you could describe it as Matsumoto's take on Barbarella in a way. He has his own spin, and it's in the end it's a very different work. But you can see how it went from seeing this Barbarella on the shelf and going like, I could do something like that. There is a European and French, I think, influence in Matsumoto's work, especially at that time, because that's what he looked at, to find his own way of drawing characters and reinvent himself as an artist.
Yeah, and so to digress from his sort of evolution here, he's continuing on with the Harlock character. So where do we see him next?
We see him the year after that, so 69. There's a Walter von Harlock appearing in a story called Pilot 262. That's the first appearance of Harlock as a World War II pilot. So this character, Walter von Harlock, is he related to the Phantom F. Harlock of later stories? We don't know. But he's a German pilot in World War II. He's flying his plane, and he finds, basically, he sees an UFO, and he follows a UFO, and in the UFO there's a beautiful and mysterious woman. And Harlock falls in love with this woman, but then she flies back to space, and Harlock stays there and wondering what the hell just happened. And so yeah, it's a short story, but yeah, you see Harlock as a Luftwaffe pilot in World War II, which is something that will happen again in a few stories. And of course, it's for us in the West, it's a bit jarring to see Harlock as a German pilot in World War II for obvious reasons. Yeah, Matsumoto fortunately finds ways to create some distance between Harlock as a character and the Nazi party.
Sure.
I mean, when it comes down to it, like in the My Youth in Arcadia films, he just blatantly says, "Yeah, I do this to pay the rent." Mm-hmm. It's not like he's
a mercenary
behind it. He's just there to make some money and make sure he can keep the lights on.
Yeah, and in the manga, I don't remember if that's in the movie actually, but in the manga that inspired this particular scene, you actually have the Tochiro equivalent, who is actually called Daiba in the manga, who paints over the swastika on the plane.
Yeah, it paints the skull on it, right?
Yep.
In the manga, it's not a skull; it paints the family crest of the Daiba clan.
Okay,
but
interesting.
But yeah, in the movie, he paints the skull and crossbone pirate flag, basically saying it's a way of saying like, yeah, we are rejecting this and putting our own flag. But in France, when this was aired basically the movie was cut into, I think, 5 episodes. And the TV channels, they really had a bit of an issue with all these flashbacks, and they cut quite a bit of moments because they could not imply that Harlock, even if it was his distant ancestor, was a Nazi, or at least a pilot in the Luftwaffe. It would take us into I think, a very interesting discussion and about the relationship between Japan and Germany, and how the Japanese see the German involvement in World War II, and how their perspective sometimes kind of miss the horror of what the Nazis were doing. But I think that would be fascinating discussion, but for another time.
Yeah, I mean, he does his best to humanize those soldiers. I think that's first and foremost what, to take something away from this before we go, is that Matsumoto seems to have his main focus on humanizing the individual soldier away from the overall situation going on there, and sort of denationalizing these lives, which I think is very, very important.
Yeah, and in the Cockpit, in the manga, again, I want to do a shout out to a wonderful blog called Anime Critic, who did a lot of very in-depth analysis of Matsumoto's work. And one thing that he pointed out is that the Cockpit does not work at all as an historical manga, because actually, if you just base your reading from a historical perspective, he mentioned battles that never happened. He mentioned places that don't exist.
Sure.
He mentioned towns, but in the wrong country. And it's enough that you get the feeling that Matsumoto is creating this setting of this fantasy World War II in a way, but that's not the real world. And he wants you to know that.
Right.
To say, yeah, I'm not doing an historical, I'm doing a story of pilots, but it exists in its own world. And in fact, there's a story he did. He did a series on famous composers and musicians, and he did a story on Furtwängler, who was the conductor in Berlin in World War II. And he's a very ambiguous figure, even historically. Was Furtwängler aware or cautioning what Hitler was doing and so on? That's a lot of debate about that. And there's a moment in the manga where Matsumoto goes all in and denounced with very, very powerful imagery the atrocities committed by the Nazis, and talking about the Shoah and stuff like that. And that's really, for me, that's really important, because in this manga, Matsumoto is being historical. And he's not like playing around. He's not saying like, yeah, there were good people on both sides. He's going like, no, these guys were monsters and they did horrible, horrible things. But here we are in history and in the Cockpit, and that includes the Arcadia of my youth stories. We are in this sort of romanticized World War II.
It's like how World War II happened within the Leijiverse itself. I just had this conversation with somebody else that's how you kind of should take the Cockpit from a historical point of view. Is it all happened? This is a World War II in the same universe that Harlock later comes into, and Yamato comes into, and Galaxy Express 39. So that's how I've seen it. But yeah, so we have this German fighter pilot, Captain Harlock, and where do we go from there?
Well, the next big incarnation of Harlock is the first time Harlock appears as a space pirate, but I think we'll get back to it a bit later, and because that's Dai Kaizoku Captain Harlock, and that's an important one. In parallel to that, Harlock appears as a cowboy for the first time. In 72, in a story called Shishunki. Sorry, I cannot say it in Japanese. But it's
Gun Frontier.
No, it's not yet Gun Frontier.
Oh, it's not Gun Frontier. Okay, so
before Gun Frontier, he does this story with Harlock. He's a Harlock called Walter Foray Harlock, And the middle name Foray might be actually, now that I think about it, might be a reference to the Commander Foray or La Foray. I don't remember exactly his name, but who was the French instructor who taught his father how to fly a plane. But even if it's not the case, maybe it's just a coincidence. But this Walter Foray Harlock is a cowboy, but he looks like Toshiro. He's a small guy with glasses. And I think in this story, so the manga name can be translated as 1 million year of puberty. And it's a story of a kid called Adachi who every time he goes to sleep, he basically, it's quantum leap. Is waking up in another time and place and in someone else's body.
Interesting.
I've heard about this. Yeah.
But not Razor Ban, right?
Yeah,
because that's the
Razor Ban is basically Matsumoto going back to that idea and doing it in a more serious way. But already that's this body surfing kind of idea. But it's very comedy. It's every character he wakes up as goes through some slapstick stuff. And so he wakes up and he's this cowboy, but it's a cowboy looking like Toshiro. And I think that's the moment when Matsumoto says, maybe I have something there to do a Far West, like Wild West series. But maybe I should not put Harlock and the Toshiro archetype as one character. Maybe I should split them in two. And a few months later starts Gun Frontier.
Okay.
So I'm thinking there's a clear, how from this short story Matsumoto gets the idea to maybe that's something I could milk a bit more. and in Gun Frontier, it's we very much have this dynamic that we know of Harlock, the tall, like Clint Eastwood kind of guy, and Toshiro being the funny guy. And in Gun Frontier, what's interesting is that Toshiro is the hero of the story. Toshiro drives the story. Toshiro is looking for his lost clan, his lost family. Harlock is his friend, tagging along and saving his life a lot of the time. But yeah, Toshiro is the one driving everything. And Harlock is a bit of a coward in this story. There are many times when he's like, yeah, no, I'm not going there. Too dangerous. And he eventually goes because then Toshiro is in danger and he has to. But in Gun Frontier, and not even going into the, let's say, the very adult tone of Gun Frontier, it's not quite yet the characters as we will know them later, but it's getting there. So 1 year after Gun Frontier, there's another Harlock as a midget with glasses in a short story. So
well, are we moving on from Gun Frontier?
Maybe,
because I was going to delay on that for a little bit, and I just, an inkling came to my mind. If we've got a Clint Eastwood character, is there a Western movie where Clint's on a travel with perhaps a Native American or Mexican character? Is there something there where perhaps he was kind of adapting another Western tale of finding family? And that's just a general curiosity in inserting sort of this Japanese character who is totally fish out of water. It's a very, very interesting story and develops Toshiro quite a bit. It really, you're saying not so much the Harlock character, but the Toshiro that I read in Gun Frontier definitely translates a lot better to the future ones. It's just a random thought there. Any thoughts? Don't leave me hanging here, guys, and say we got to go on this podcast.
But I don't know, because Matsumoto has been doing some straight adaptations. I mean, Laramie, which was, I don't know if I pronounced that right, actually, but it was a TV show. And Matsumoto...
Oh, Laramie, yes.
It was a TV show. Matsumoto did the manga adaptation of that. And probably some of these characters are like a stepping stone toward Harlock. And there was 5 giants from Texas, Cinque de la Vendetta, which I have here in Italian.
Oh, okay.
Italian edition of that. So that's straight adaptation of a spaghetti western movie, which Matsumoto did, and it's a couple of years before Gun Frontier, and you can see how this type of western, very adult, with a lot of sexy stuff and a lot of characters who are dirty and nasty and stuff like that.
Yeah.
A dirtier kind of western compared to what Americans were doing. Italian westerns, they had their own spin on it, and you can see how that influences Gun Frontier and the tone of Gun Frontier. Gun Frontier, in a way, is an exaggeration of the spaghetti western tropes.
Yeah.
Seen through Japanese eyes, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely some third-party info there. Chad, please.
I was just going through the IMDb profile for Clint Eastwood, what he may have had going that would influence this. There's actually a film, 93 minutes long, called Escapade in Japan. And it's kind of the reverse of that. It's there's a plane on its way to Japan. It's forced to land at sea and just off the Japanese coast. Small American boy survives by ditching, but separated from the rest of his passengers, and basically gets raised in Japan.
Oh, that's very interesting. So,
and
that's why we keep Chad around, guys. That's a quick IMDb. Please.
But there's another probable huge inspiration for Gun Frontier. It's a movie from 1971, so just 1 year before Gun Frontier, called Red Sun, which was I think it was a sort of co-production between probably Italy, France. There was Alain Delon in it, Charles Bronson, Ursula Andress, and also Japanese actors like Toshiro Mifune, who was a big name at the time. And it's a story of a Japanese ambassador basically coming to the West and having to team up with some cowboys and a clash of culture. And so I'm pretty sure that because Matsumoto is really a movie enthusiast. I mean, he would go and see lots of movies, and you can see that in his work. And so, I mean, big Western with some of the biggest names in Japanese cinema. I'm pretty sure Matsumoto went to see it.
Sure.
So probably that inspired him quite a bit.
Yeah, lots of different bits and pieces. I mean, that's what makes a good creator, right? Can you hide your source? Can you let everybody in on a new adventure by taking all these little bits and pieces? So very, very interesting to elaborate on Gun Frontier, because it does kind of get brushed aside a lot of the time.
It's a difficult one to read today because it's so insensitive.
It's gritty. I will say it is gritty.
It is gritty, and it's pretty. It's dirty, and it's very sexist, and you are really to appreciate it. You have to really put it back in the context of it's the 70s, early 70s, in a time where creators are going wild with this
Sure.
stuff.
I mean, we could also say, there's a lot of controversy about Django Unchained, and we could go down that whole rabbit hole there and get into the nitty gritty of what it is to present nitty and gritty. But let's not have that conversation today. Let's see where Harlock went next.
Well, next, basically 1 year after Gun Frontier. So as I was saying, there's once again a short Harlock called W.C. Harlock, which is quite probably exactly a reference to what you think about with the letters WC, and he's again a short guy, short-sighted, and he must go into a duel with an enemy called SM Ozology. I'm not making that up.
SM Oology, and you skipped right up. Not everybody may know WC. May not know.
Basically, it's a reference to toilets.
Okay.
So you are basically a guy named Toilets or Bathroom going away against a guy called SM.
Is that like
so that's
BM?
Matsumoto's humor right there. That's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
It happens in a manga. The name of this manga can be translated as basically the saga of short-sighted mankind. So it's only stories of guys suffering from myopia, through time and space.
Yeah.
That's the sort of things that you don't know where to put. You're doing like, okay, so Matsumoto's Leijiverse, and you have this thing, and you're like, where am I putting that? I don't know.
Just another cycle on the Ring of Time, and let it be.
And in this manga, there's another story with a Harlock figure, and that's actually the first Phantom F Harlock.
Okay.
And he's a pilot of like a space mission who returns to Earth like centuries after he left because of hyperspace or whatever. And he arrives and basically mankind has devolved into only short guys with glasses. And
Utopia.
They're all waiting for Harlock to come back because he represents like a manly man. It's like the Messiah. And Harlock comes down the ship and he actually has huge glasses because all these years he was staring at screens in his spaceship, and so he becomes short-sighted himself. So that's Matsumoto's sense of humor right there. But that's the first Phantom F Harlock appearing in Matsumoto stories that I know of. But yeah, shortly after that, he will become a bit more serious with Harlock, stop using it, the name, the character in these crazy situations. And he does a story that people who watch the movie, Arcadia of My Youth know very well, called Stanley no Majo. So the Witch of Stanley. Which is the story of, again, Phantom F Harlock. So the F is now there to stay. Probably it's a reference to actually the Harlock of Gun Frontier, who was Franklin Harlock.
Yeah.
And so Phantom F Harlock may be the son of Franklin Harlock. We don't know. He's a pilot in the early 20th century, like in the 20s maybe, who has his biplane, and once called, I'm not sure if it's already called the Arcadia in the manga. Maybe it is. But basically I'm checking in it. It actually is already called Arcadia in this story. And he wants to fly his plane across the Owen Stanley, mountain range, so in New Guinea. And basically it's the story of his duel with the mountain, and the mountain defeats him again and again, and it starts appearing like this witch laughing at him. And so that's one of the two big stories that were taken and made into Arcadia of My Youth. And in fact, that's the flashback part of the story, because in the manga, the sort of present day story is actually during World War II, where a Japanese plane needs to do the same flight, basically, across the mountain. And they only succeed because the pilot is actually reading the diary of Phantom F Harlock telling this story. So at least we know he survived to tell his story. And he's reading that and he thinks, okay, that's just a fairy tale, you know. And but then, again, the mountain is not...
The witch appears.
Yeah, the witch appears and laughs at him, and he's like, whoa. And in fact, in the end, he manages to go through, but only because the crew he was carrying basically jumps off the plane to make it lighter. And they took that bit of story, which works in this context. Of course, it's like a fairy tale in a way, or a morality tale. But they took this and they reused it in Arcadia of My Youth, when the witch becomes his twin sons, and the Arcadia has to go through it, and the Tokargan survivors decide to sacrifice themselves, and it makes no sense at all I mean, like, why, like 6 guys kill themselves and suddenly the ship is lighter?
Well, it's that's because it feeds off of life energy. It attracts life force, which is apparently its own physical property that we haven't discovered yet in our reality, and that's what reduces the gravitational pull. So they do explain it, but it is a fairy tale, like you say. It is a sci fantasy, but not a science fiction.
It's interesting to see that they try to take the original story from the Cockpit and adapt it with the spaceship and so on, even if it does not completely work or not as well as the original tale. Yeah. But yeah, that's Phantom F. Harlock, and he actually reappears in another story a bit later called The Birdman of Kilimanjaro, where it's a story of pilots from all over the world fighting it off in Africa. And there's a Japanese pilot, so he's not called Oyama, but he looks like Toshiro. And he actually fights with his enemy biplane. And eventually they shoot each other and they crash, both of them crash, and the pilot of the biplane comes out of the plane, and it's Phantom F. Harlock, the same one. He has the same design than in the Witch of Stanley story. And he says basically, "Wow, you're a good pilot, guy, and I'm impressed. You're the first Japanese person I meet, and wow, maybe there's something there, you know." So it's like, yes, maybe the first meeting of Harlock and Toshiro, even before the ones from the later story. I don't know, but yeah, there's this sort of respect between this Phantom F. Harlock guy and meeting this Japanese guy and befriending each other, even if they were enemy 2 minutes before. That's the story of Phantom F. Harlock, basically, who gets a son later, a few years later. So in 1976, there's a story in the Cockpit again called Wagaseishu no Arcadia, so Arcadia of my youth. And that's basically the World War II flashback from the movie, except that, as we were mentioning before, there's no Oyama. The Japanese guy is not Oyama, is Daiba. Apart from that, it's very similar to what we see in the movie. We have both of them are pretty disgusted and do not recognize themselves in what their countries are doing. So they decide to defect and flee to this legendary place, Heiligenstadt, which is from the movie Marianne of My Youth. Matsumoto is a huge fan of that movie. It's not a real place. I mean, this Heiligenstadt is somewhere on the border between France and Switzerland and Germany somehow. And they want to reach that place because that's basically the birthplace of the Harlock clan, and they hope that they can start anew there. But during the flight, the Daiba gets wounded, and Harlock bravely decides to attract the resistance fighters who are coming to kill them away, and he gets shot and he gets blinded. And again, that's something they took from that story and put that in Arcadia of My Youth. And again, it doesn't make quite so much sense in the movie, but here, in the manga, you have this epilogue taking place like 20 years later, and you see that Harlock has survived, that he's blind now, but he survived. He has a daughter called Selene, and basically Daiba's son comes to find him to give him back the Revi aiming device from the plane, and saying like, I'm giving you back your eyes, basically. That's what inspires the scene in the movie where in the far future, for the final battle, Toshiro brings out the Revi aiming device and put it in the Arcadia to shoot lasers, because why not? In the manga, it's a bit more symbolic. Because
does he refer to it as our eye in the manga?
I'm not sure, actually. I cannot tell you that.
Okay.
But there's this also teasing that Harlock wishes that his daughter will marry Daiba's son, and they become one family in the future or something.
Interesting. Setting up a sort of arranged Leijiverse marriage there, potentially. Very, very royal, almost.
And what's funny is that you have this very serious, very dramatic ending, and you have Harlock like speaking in the wrong direction, and Daiba urinating in the plants behind him,
Yes.
and it's like it's the tone.
Chad, fill us in. What are you feeling, Chad? Just lay it on us.
What is it with Potato Man and urinating everywhere?
They got a few drinks in him. I think that's the name of the game. He's got a few drinks in him.
And there's an example of a story in 73 called Wadachi, where you have a bit of Matsumoto riffing on his own tatami kind of story. But
the 4.5 tatami trilogy we're talking about.
Oidon and Daiyojoan.
And for those unfamiliar, Otoko Oiden being Leiji Matsumoto's breakthrough manga, the one that really brought him his widespread acclaim in Japan.
Yeah.
So this sort of slice of life story of sort of almost autobiographical.
Yeah. And with Wadachi, Matsumoto basically takes Otoko Oidon and throw it into space. With some sexaroid added into it, and in there's actually a villain called Harlock, and he's a very nasty character and a very evil guy, and he looks, even if he has a scar, he has the hair and so on, but right away you see him, you know that this guy is up to no good, because he never looks like heroic. He's always like a bit shifty in how he's drawn and so on. So that's funny to see Matsumoto takes his own archetype and play with it a bit and using it in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. That seems to be his whole thing here, just reconstructing every little bit, and you see that's basically how he built his entire career. So it makes sense that Harlock follows that trajectory.
In a way, and Tezuka was as well, but Matsumoto even more, I think, is the artist of obsession. He has his key obsessions, and he revisits them, recycles them, mix them up, mashes them up all the time. And that's what makes his work, actually. You can feel like, okay, this is a body of work of an artist, because every piece of it could only be done by this guy. Yeah, very signature. And yeah, so that's basically all the various kind of Harlocks that happen, and that a bit of one-shot character. From there, we can go back to Daikaizoku Captain Harlock, which I mentioned in passing, because that's where the space pirate Captain Harlock emerges.
The classic, the quintessential, what we know today as Captain Harlock really takes solid form in Space Pirate Captain Harlock, the manga. But this is before Space Battleship Yamato?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is in 1970. So Matsumoto is riding the eye of Sexaroid in a way, and suddenly, like, the world of sci-fi, adult sci-fi has opened to him. And so he does this story. So it's a one-shot story called Daikaizoku Captain Harlock. So Great Pirate Captain Harlock. And so there's a Captain Harlock. It's called Phantomant Harlock. So a bit of a variation on the name, but he has a ship called the Death Shadow. The first time there's a Death Shadow ship. It doesn't look at all like the ships we know and love from later works, but it's called the Death Shadow, so that's a start. And he's actually a pretty bad guy. He's a pirate in the nasty sense of the word, but he's motivated by vengeance. Basically, what you discover in the story is that he's a veteran of a space war, and at some point he was captured by the enemy faction, and they castrated him. So this Harlock doesn't feel like a man anymore, and he's basically, that's the first time you have this idea of Harlock looking for the great battle where he will die as a man. And before he does that, because he dies at the end, he finds a young guy who reminds him of himself, and he gives him his ship. He gives him his wife as well.
Yes, Francoise.
Françoise, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be, I almost got the feeling that she was maybe a little bit more free than just to him in that story.
You get the feeling that since Harlock lost his manly parts, he has given his wife a lot of freedom to do whatever she wants because he understands that he cannot satisfy her anymore.
But she's very, very loyal to him in the same way.
And so at the end, this young guy basically becomes Harlock. He takes the ship, he takes the woman, he takes the name, he takes the cape. And so that's interesting because you get the feeling that when I saw the CGI movie of released in 2013, I got the feeling that they went back to that in a way, a more darker, a bit villainous in a way version of Harlock, who find a successor, and I get the feeling that the original ending they had in mind was really the old Harlock dies with his sort of impossible battle, so a new positive Harlock takes over. It's interesting because Matsumoto really was against that ending because he felt that they were killing off Harlock and that should not happen. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thing because you see that somehow the creator of the character now has an idea of the character that is incompatible with how it started. And so the movie, they would try to went back to how it started, and the creator himself was against that because they say, no, that's not Harlock anymore. So that you can see these tensions in the CGI movie.
It's interesting in the CGI movie because I see it as if Harlock were to live forever, he's still man, and that would be an inevitability. I mean, Harlock as a character is not perfect. There is this nagging human sadness and regret and loss and emptiness that in Great Pirate he is absolved of. He actually helps that young boy kill his girlfriend and his the person that his girlfriend is cheating on by sending him onto a planet of cannibals, I believe, or some sort of murderous monster. So I definitely see what you're saying though. There are some parallels there that perhaps we're being taken from and tried to insert, but the original production team for 3D Harlock didn't quite execute in a way that maintained Harlock's essence.
Harlock has taken many incarnations over the years, and you mentioned the human side of Harlock, and I think that's something very nice in the 78 manga and anime, is that you see Harlock being more human in a way, and you can think what you want of Mayu, the little girl that in the anime Harlock has to save every time, and so on. She does bring out this more fatherly kind of side of Harlock, but in the manga, when she doesn't exist or just as a mention in passing, there's a scene that I really like where Harlock basically loses it. A moment, he screams his frustration and says, so many times I wanted to take the guns of my ship and shoot at this crappy planet, get rid of it because basically they don't deserve. And then he gets a hold of himself, and there is no. And it shows that he's not considering like Earth is a perfect planet and humans are the best in the universe. So he's very lucid or very self-aware of the flaws and limits of humans but here he states basically who he is. And I'm frustrated. Sometimes I hate those guys, but yet here I am, and they need someone to defend them, and it's going to be me. And it's very Byronic in a way, It's like, I'm not doing it because I like it, but because there's nobody else to do it, so I will be there for them, even if they don't deserve it. And for me,
hatred and love are like this. We learn that throughout life. So,
and for me, that's a great moment because it also shows Harlock as a flawed character. You can root for him. He's heroic. He's fighting for Earth, but he's not like blindly heroic. He's not like my country for above all. He's a realist in a way.
Absolutely. Getting back on track here. So we're talking about Great Pirate, and then where do we want to go from Great Pirate, Captain?
I think we should probably go into Yamato.
Sure, absolutely.
It's an interesting case because it started as an anime project for which Matsumoto was brought to do the character design. Again, it was in the early 70s, so he was really like coming on the scene as this guy who does great sci-fi manga. So he was a natural choice to hire to do the character design for this. But of course, Matsumoto, being a storyteller, and he brought a lot of his own ideas on the table.
Yeah.
And one of the things he wanted to do was to have Captain Harlock appear in Yamato. And the plan was that this version of Captain Harlock was in fact the lost brother of Susumu Kodai, so the main character of Yamato, who had become like burned by radiation in battle, so he had to hide his face, and so the ship, it's a Death Shadow, appearing in its nearly final design. You have this idea that it's a Death Shadow because everyone on board is dying from radiation poisoning, and yet they don't exist. They've become like ghosts. They're pirates. It's a bit of a ghost ship in a way. So again, some ideas that they reused in the CGI movie much later. This sort of much more gothic kind of take.
Well, even as soon as Space Pirate Captain Harlock, it's a ghost ship because it's haunted by the ghost of Totoro.
Yeah, but here it's really like it's really a ship full of people.
Chad, I'm 100% on this idea. Chad doubts.
But it's as we know, Yamato was not such a big success when it was first aired, so they cut the length of the series to only 26 episodes, I think. And so all this subplot with Mamoru Kodai and being Captain Harlock, they shelved it and did something else with it. But when Matsumoto drew the manga adaptation, well, he brought it back because that's what he wanted to do. But it's very interesting because when you think about all the legal problems that arise later between Matsumoto and Nishizaki, which was the guy who originated the Yamato project, all the questions of ownership, and in the end, it was a third party. So that's a topic for another podcast, as we were discussing that earlier.
Yeah, definitely want to dive into the difficulties with Yamato and Matsumoto at some point.
But in the end, maybe it was for the better, because if Harlock had appeared in Yamato as Matsumoto had planned, that would have meant that he would have maybe lost the rights to this character later on. So in the end, maybe it's a blessing in disguise that he was not able to do that story on screen, because that way he kept all the ownership of Harlock.
And it's interesting too. I was noting the character design, and I've talked a little bit in my interview with Darren John Ashmore about this. The symbology of which eye is covered, the loss of sight. And there's sort of this overarching idea in many different mythologies of the loss of physical sight leading to the gaining of another worldly sight. And there's also the difference between your left and your right, the yin and your yang. And he switched the eye, which is lost between each of those. I mean, I don't know if anybody has anything to say on that more specifically, but just Chad, please just start interrupting us. I beg you. Please just open your mouth and we'll shut up. But please.
Yeah, I will never shut up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, please.
Well, when it comes to the whole losing of your eye, there's actually a. So, have you ever heard of the author named Ambrose Bierce?
Ambrose Pierce?
Ambrose Bierce.
Ambrose Bierce, no.
So basically, he was this guy, I think he was alive during the American Revolutionary War. No, not Revolutionary. Civil War. So it was a big divide there. And essentially, he had this thing that he called the Devil's Dictionary, where he would go through and define several words. And when it came to cynic, it would basically go on to describe a blackguard that he was enabled to see how things are by the fault of his vision. And basically there was like a little bit of lore behind it. But yeah, basically it would go on to say that, you would see things better, more accurately because of your lost vision. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you had to focus in on it. I just thought that was always kind of prevalent with Harlock, who he was either always hopeful or he was just bitter and detached.
Mm-hmm. And that might...
That's nice symbolism there.
Yeah, his physical sight being correct me if I'm wrong, but his physical sight being that more bitter view, that more realistic view. They say depressed people actually have a more accurate idea of what is going on in the world. This is a scientific claim, but people who are less depressed have a more perhaps otherworldly view of things, and that's removing yourself from the very physical observation and to perhaps a more spiritual.
Yeah, I'd say that.
Yeah, very interesting.
And if you take into account the fascination that Matsumoto has for the Norse mythology through Wagner and the Ring of the Nibelungen, and in Norse mythology, Odin, or Wotan, if you want the German name, basically sacrifices one of his eyes by taking it and putting it into the source of knowledge to gain this knowledge of the universe. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if that's something Matsumoto consciously used as part of, probably the eye patch is just because he's a pirate and pirates wear eye patch, But yeah, knowing about Matsumoto, there's always some things that, even if he's not necessarily consciously using it, but since he's feeding from all this stuff, it finds its way.
Yeah, third hand sort of like, he might not have observed that himself, but the source that he got it from did.
After Yamato, Harlock appears in a sort of main role or main secondary role, probably. In a one-shot story called Queen Emeraldas. So that's before Emeraldas gets her own series. Emeraldas is a very interesting character because in many ways she is what we call a distaff counterpart to Harlock. She's Harlock female double in a way. And a lot of people just because of that, tend to assume, and I always find that very funny, that Harlock and Emeraldas are a couple. Mm-hmm. And usually it's because they don't know much about the Matsumoto universe. But
yeah, I see it getting shipped in the fan art quite often, and I'm a Totoro stan, so that hurts me deep down.
But yeah. And when you tell people actually Emeraldas' true love is Toshiro. Mm-hmm. They're like, what? But it makes sense if you remember that Toshiro is Matsumoto's stand-in in the story. So in Queen Emeraldas, it's a short story, which is not a space pirate story. Actually, it's very similar, or it reminds me actually of a game setting called Crimson Skies. People might know about it. So it's a sort of steampunk or diesel punk world with zeppelins. Fighting and what's interesting is that in this short story, Matsumoto makes references to Boken Key. So this is very, very old stuff he did 22 years before when he was a kid. And so the Harlock appearing in this one shot is dressed in white with a black skull, which was exactly the design of Captain Kingston in Boken Key. So Harlock is not a Errol Flynn lookalike in this story, but you can see how Matsumoto basically, gives a sort of high five to his younger self in a way in this story, like going like, hey, remember this stuff I drew when I was a kid? Well, I'm actually going to revisit that in a way. And there's a treasure map, and the treasure map in the Queen Emeraldas one-shot looks a lot like the treasure map from Boken Key, with a lot of funny stuff written on the map and puns and so on. So it really feels like Matsumoto decided to reference himself. Maybe it's a way to say, hey, look how far I came.
Mm-hmm. But that's very interesting to talk about, Emeraldis as a potential female face of Captain Harlock, even though they're living in the same world. But there are some differences to Harlock from Emeraldis that might be interesting to note there. Yeah. What are the differences between Emeraldis and Harlock? Firstly, we could say right off the bat, she has her vision. She's seeing the world as it is, perhaps a bit more. Whereas, and if we take it to sight, we're seeing Totoro with the myopia and his inability to see reality fully with either eye, and giving him his sort of optimistic, energetic nature that Harlock needs, but it seems Emeraldis desperately needs. She's even more entrenched in the bitterness of reality than Harlock. So in some ways you could say she's an even more cynical version of Harlock.
But that's not the case yet in this particular story, where Emeraldas is the hero, and she actually shares this Zeppelin ship, and she has a crew, which is something that will go away very, very soon after that. She has a crew of entirely female pirates, and on her rival, best frenemy is Harlock, who has his own Zeppelin and a crew entirely male. And that's where you see the first version of Yataran, who was based on Matsumoto's assistant and Kaoru Shintani, and he made him into a character because he was seeing him all day, and he said, "Can I make you into a character in my manga?" And so for the first time, Harlock has a first mate, Yataran, who is this guy who will later be known as the guy who built models all the time.
Was that the assistant that made Area 88?
Yep, that's him.
That's what I thought. Okay. And Area 88, that character is almost sort of a face of Harlock as well, or at least an adaptation of Harlock's face. And that character this is unconfirmed, but may very well be the inspiration for Roy Fokker from Macross, the similarities between the 88. So the face of Harlock sort of bled into anime in the 80s. Which is very interesting.
And Macross, especially when it came out, was a sort of
parody?
I wouldn't necessarily say parody.
It apparently developed as a parody. I just saw a video by Mercury Falcon, so go check out their work on YouTube. But
but clearly it's inspired by or in reaction to Yamato. There's a lot of Yamato in Macross.
Yeah, Miyako, or not Miyako Maki, but I'm forgetting their name, but yeah, the KO group, as they were known, the people who made Macross later were very, very inspired by Space Battleship Yamato. So, again, something else probably for another episode to talk about how influential the Leijiverse was.
And there's in the Queen Emeraldas one shot, if I manage to see it, that's a problem when you.
I have mine over here too,
but there's this hilarious moment here when the male crew of Harlock encounters for the first time the female crew of Emeraldas, who are not that good looking when Matsumoto draws them. But when the guys see these girls for the first time, they are drawn in total shoujo style. And I think that's actually probably Matsumoto's wife, Miyako Maki, who came and drew this panel. In like the purest shoujo ever with sparkling things, because like it's like, whoa, that's a girl, whoa,
oh yeah,
so beautiful.
So, yeah, I think I can give a little bit more insight on that. I don't want to get too wrapped up in visuals here because this will be put on the internet as a audio podcast, but we can see there being Harlock's crew is already, they're very apt to take off their pants is what we're seeing here, and they're getting slapped around as well by these ladies, so having their own fun interaction there.
From there, we go into another short story, and now we're getting really, really close to Harlock as we know him now. And this short story is Space Battleship Death Shadow. And it's, again, it's 1975, later that year, in November. And as is often with Matsumoto, is Matsumoto using a previous story and say, okay, can I push that in a slightly different direction? And so from the Queen Emeraldas one-shot, you get, again, this idea that you have Harlock and his male crew fighting against an entirely female adversary. And this time the females are aliens. Mm-hmm. And it's not the Amazon, but we're getting there. And it's a one-shot. Harlock is at war with these women, and at some point he realizes that, okay, maybe we should not make war and make love instead. And that's basically where it goes. And Matsumoto has this ending where Harlock, after like disembarking his crew to build a future with his former enemies, Harlock goes into space alone, or so we think, because he actually has a female companion, and it's actually the spirit of his love who is in the computer of the ship.
Yes, her detached head, it seems, is
she appears as a detached head
yes.
in the final scene. And so that's very interesting when you think that Toshiro feels that role later.
Yes.
So shippers out there, you can think about it.
Something for perhaps a fraternal love rather than any romantic one. As we know in Gun Frontier, they are hesitant to engage in a menage a trois because they believe they would not be able to maintain their enthusiasm for the activity at the very sight of each other nude.
But yeah, with this story, Space Battleship Death Shadow, we are basically it's like a pilot episode
mm-hmm.
for Space Pirate Captain Harlock, the series that will start a couple of years later and builds upon this idea of a female alien antagonist and Harlock fighting them and so on. When Space Pirate Captain Harlock arrives, now all these various Harlocks that were one-shot characters, pretty much, with the exception of the Gun Frontier one, who had a longer run. But all these versions of Harlock come together, and because it's a longer manga, because it becomes an anime series, now Harlock is defined.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Harlock people will know.
So we come into this seminal work, this very important manga that dominated the year it was released, right? I mean, this was, if you were a manga enthusiast, a shonen manga enthusiast in Japan when Harlock came out, this was what you were reading. This was what captured everybody's imagination. And this is what solidifies Harlock as the quintessential Leiji Matsumoto character, no?
In the West, at least, clearly. In Japan, the Captain Harlock series was always a bit behind in terms of popularity from another big hit of Matsumoto that was published and aired roughly at the same time, which was Galaxy Express. And Galaxy Express was a big Matsumoto legendary work for Japanese audience.
From what I understood, Harlock won quite a few awards in Japan when it was released, and was the most, I believe it was voted in a shonen poll, the most popular character.
Yeah,
but
it was a success.
Yeah,
without a doubt.
For that year, at least.
It was a bit overshadowed by the space train that came after, just right behind it.
Interesting. Okay.
And in fact, that's probably the reason why there have been a few instances where Harlock also was used by Matsumoto as a supporting character. For instance, in Diver Zero. And in Diver Zero, you see, again, it's in 1975, so again, it's just before Space Pirate Captain Harlock. Here, Harlock is not the main character. He's basically a mentor for this young android called Diver Zero. Since Harlock is around a bit more and gets to do stuff, and you get to see his ship and blah blah blah, you see a bit more of his crew as well, and that's when you see, for instance, the first appearance of Mime. And what's interesting is that in this story, so Mime is Harlock's basically cat in female form. That's how Matsumoto described her a lot. She is a female companion that's always there to spend time with Harlock and listen to him and be a sort of silent companion. And in this story, in Diver Zero, Mime is a bit more mischievous. She's closer to the characters that inspired her name, which was a character from Wagner, Ring of the Nibelungen. And there's a dwarf called Mime. And Mime becomes Mime because once translated into Japanese, the name becomes Mime, and that reminds as well the name of Matsumoto's cat, which was Mi or Mi-kun. So yeah, all of this stuff comes together. And what's interesting is that in Diver Zero, in the early chapters, there's actually two Mimes aboard Harlock's ships. Like they're like these elf kind of looking like younger girls, but with very pointed ears and very impish, but very quickly he removes one and there's only one left in the story. But that's interesting because you have this sort of elvish kind of design that they will reuse in the CGI movie, making her less useful in appearance, but this kind of elf lady, very otherworldly style. And so, yeah, with Matsumoto, nothing is ever lost. Any idea can turn again in a later work. You never know.
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about it more in the next podcast, but the next big appearance of Harlock as a supporting character is in the Galaxy Express movie, the first one, which is interesting because he basically does not appear really in the manga or in the animated series, or there's a fake Captain Harlock in some point, but is always hidden around a cloak or something. But in the movie, Galaxy Express movie, they decided to use Harlock and use it quite prominently in the story, in a very similar fashion that what Harlock does in Diver Zero, that is being this mentor figure for the younger hero character. So that's interesting, and I think probably a lot of that comes from Lintaro, because Lintaro was the director on the Captain Harlock animated series, and so when he becomes the director of the Galaxy Express feature, I think probably he wanted to reuse the character.
Yeah,
so maybe that's actually Matsumoto who wanted that. I'm not sure, but I get the feeling that Lintaro was probably a big drive there to put Harlock in a stronger role in the movie.
Now, with the Diver Zero, that revolves around a primarily mechanized cast, right?
Yep.
That's just kind of like jumping the gun for like the timeline that Leiji Matsumoto has before he starts humanizing a lot of the elements for the mechanized characters. Like, to have Harlock start up as this mentor, like you were saying, I just think that's amusing that he starts on that before he even starts to make the Galaxy Express film.
What do you mean by jumping the gun there? Do you mean that this is just predating it, or could you elaborate on?
Predating it, but also just changing up that what's the right term? The theme of causing, like, for most of like the mythos, the Illumidos mechanized, characters, whether they're automatons or what, they pretty much have like one set focus, and it's like you do your function and you continue doing that. Meanwhile, you have Maytel, who she changes things entirely, but that's in Galaxy Express. She recruits people with strong willpower that would overpower that kind of programming. And I just think that's really interesting that, Harlock is also harboring that kind of mentorship in the Diver Zero character, which would come up later in the dimensional voyage.
Yeah. And especially because in Diver Zero, you have the revelation at some point that Harlock himself is not fully mechanized, but some of his body parts were replaced because he'd been in so many battles that he had to get partially mechanized. So you get the thing, you have the hero, it's a bit of a reverse Galaxy Express in a way, because the hero is already an android. Diver Zero is an android, he's an android boy, and his mentor towards humanity, in a way, is this pirate guy who is human but partially a machine himself because he had to sacrifice so much. So you have a lot of symbolism there. And so far, before meeting Harlock, basically Zero met only awful humans who were mistreating robots and machines, which is also a bit of a reverse to what Matsumoto does in some other works. Here in Diver Zero, the machines are really the sympathetic ones. They are enslaved by mankind and brutalized by mankind. And Zero hates humans at the beginning of his journey. And then he meets Harlock, and Harlock basically first tells him, see, I'm not so completely different from you. I'm part machine myself. And look, meet my crew. Not all humans are bad. Some of us are nice. Some of us are brave. And so he shows the better side, the better part of mankind to Zero. And he never treats him as a machine. He treats him as a man or as a boy. He says, you can join my crew if you want, and we would be happy to have you. And Zero is like, thank you, but I have to find my own path. Basically, that's his thing. And the manga, as often with Matsumoto, it doesn't have a true ending. But that was very nice to see Zero come again in Dimensional Voyage as a sort of older version who is still a bit angry. He still has some issues, but he's also a trusted ally to Harlock, and he has a clearly love for Mayu, who is Tochiro's daughter. And I'm spoiling stuff there, so maybe I will stop. But it was nice to see this character, that they managed to take this character and put it back into the Harlock's tale, basically.
And then you have a Zero in Cosmo Warrior Zero, which makes sense that this happened, that there was a sympathy towards machine men interlaced with this Galaxy Express sort of opposite sentiment there. And later we have Cosmo Warrior Zero, where the machine men are sort of in charge, but there's a human leading them, and there's this sentiment towards the machine men to just disrespect them, load them with all the labor. So not to get too much into that whole rabbit hole, that just talking about machine men could be an episode in and of itself. So back on Harlock.
So Harlock plays a big part in Galaxy Express, in both Galaxy Express movies. Basically, in the second one, he's basically there. They don't even try to explain what he's doing here. He's here to help Tetsuro. And he appears when the plot needs him to appear. That's basically his role. But it's cool. Basically, the fact that Harlock appears in Galaxy Express, it's like when, a guest hosts Saturday Night Live or something, and suddenly they become in the spotlight again. So because of his appearance in Galaxy Express and the new ship, which was very cool. And it's funny because it's purely a merchandising decision because I think Bandai was one of the producers of the Galaxy Express movies. And when Harlock appeared, they say, but wait, if he appears in his blue ship from his own anime series, people will buy the models that our rival Takara is selling. So we want him to have a different ship design for this movie. And so enters the green ram, skull ram. I don't know you describe it.
It's phallic.
Arcadia.
It's phallic is what it is.
Yeah,
where we're at.
The manly Arcadia.
Yes.
And
the big green giant.
Matsumoto spent a lot of time and energy afterwards trying to retcon why there's different designs and you can feel that sometimes he's a bit struggling to explain, to find a logical connection between these designs. But yeah, and originally it's 100% a merchandising decision.
Yeah.
Basically, Harlock, with his guest appearances in these two movies, there's desire, or perceived maybe desire, from the audience to get more another Harlock-centric anime. And there, Toei Animation has a problem because there's no other Harlock manga. Matsumoto only did 5 volumes of Captain Harlock, and he didn't even finish the story. So Toei has to find some material to make a new movie, and so they basically did a bit what we just did. They went back into Matsumoto's works and tried to find various versions of Harlock, tried to make that a story about Harlock's lineage through the ages, basically. So that's why they pick the Witch of Stanley story, they pick the Arcadia of My Youth story, and they say, okay, so that's our thread. We can tell the story about how Harlock and Toshiro first met, and there was a couple of flashback episodes about that in the 78 series. But say, okay, but we have this very emotional scene of Toshiro's dying in Galaxy Express, so maybe we can actually see that same scene from another angle in a future series. I mean, they're trying to find some stuff, some glue. But it's really driven by Toei at this point, because we know there is a video of the pilot of the series that Matsumoto wanted to do, called Kaizoku Kikan Arcadia. So Arcadia as a pirate ship or something like that. And it's very different from what Toei eventually made. The Matsumoto one is much more poetic and strange and trippy than the story of the Illumidas and so on. So what Toei did is to build the story of this movie. They went to something else that Matsumoto did, which is in 1980, Matsumoto tried to write some short stories, sci-fi short stories. He didn't make Harlock short stories, even if it's very similar in tone and everything. He told the story of another character with basically Harlock ex-spy called Aldart. So it's Aldart, the wanderer of space, the wanderer warrior of space. And he wrote 3 short stories about this character who travels the galaxy with a woman called Mesela and a short, bespectacled guy called Toshiro. And they have adventure in space, and they fight an evil empire called the Illumidas. And so Toei sees this material and say, okay, Aldart is basically Harlock, let's not fool around.
Yeah.
So let's use that as the basis of our new animated series. And it's funny because a few years later, these stories were republished, and actually Matsumoto went back and changed Aldart into Harlock, because he himself saw that he wasn't fooling anyone.
Are you saying that this is like a light novel, and this is not a manga, or was this illustrated?
This is really a light novel, or it's really Matsumoto trying his hand as writing and illustrating himself. And I think because at the time he was doing a lot of artwork for Japanese editions of stories by Andre Norton or Catherine Lucille Moore, which, like Northwest of Earth, which was a very seminal character in sci-fi, because that's basically Northwest of Earth is where we get Han Solo from. He's a sort of prototype of this sort of cool but a bit amoral outlaw smuggler, but still he has a heroic side.
Where does this come from? I'm totally lost. So Northwest of Earth is...
It's a series of short stories by an American writer called Catherine Lucille Moore.
Okay.
And in the 70s, these are translated into Japanese and published in Japan. So it was originally in the 30s. So it's very, very old.
Okay.
Like it's 1 century ago. It's not that old, but still.
It's pretty old.
And Catherine Lucille Moore is a very interesting writer. And that would be a very, very interesting topic for later. I hope you're keeping note of all this.
Sure.
Of all this.
It's recorded.
But Catherine Lucille Moore, she wrote basically she had two main characters. One was Northwest of Earth, Northwest Smith, with a space wanderer, brooding, lone wolf kind of guy. And it's basically who Han Solo is based on.
Mm.
And our other character is Jirel de Joiry, Jirel of Joiry, who is it's a fantasy. It's basically fantasy first female heroine.
Okay.
It's in a time where it was Conan and all those guys. C.L. Moore comes and say, okay, I'm going to tell sword and sorcery tales, but with a female main character. And Jirel is a very cold, very strong, but flawed at the same time. She has long red hair. And in the 70s, Matsumoto does the artwork for the Japanese editions of both these characters. So again, that's something that feeds, I think, into the creation of Harlock and Emeraldis. And in 80, he wants to try to write some stories in that vein. And that's how he ends up writing these 3 short stories with this character named Aldart, who is really a stand-in for Harlock. Mm-hmm. For some reason, maybe it was a publisher who did not want it to be a straight Harlock story, because maybe for rights reason, I don't know. But Aldart, the space wanderer, fights the Illumidas with Mesela, who is basically Jirel, or Emeraldas, how you want to see it, and Toshiro, who is his best friend. So, and they go and they fight the Illumidas, and at the end, they pick their flag, and it's a pirate flag, of course.
Mm-hmm.
That's really that's literature. That's not manga. That's written short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Toei uses that material, use it as a basis for the setting of the new Harlock film Arcadia of My Youth and TV series, using the Illumidas, using the 3 characters like Harlock, Emeraldas, Toshiro. Even if Emeraldas gets sidelined a bit in the series, but she's still a very important figure in the story. And when Matsumoto rewrites a bit the stories later to publish them in a collection, he actually called the story Gun Frontier 2.
Oh, interesting.
So, maybe because he felt like these space wanderers with basically Harlock, Emeraldas, and Toshiro reminded him of Harlock, Shinonora, and Toshiro from Gun Frontier. I'm not in his head. I don't know what he had in mind exactly, but it was released as Gun Frontier 2 later.
And of course, we're talking about Endless Orbit SSX, which follows the My Youth in Arcadia story and tells it's really the gospel of the Leijiverse, if you consider Totoro to be a sort of a Jesus stand-in for that gospel. He makes an ultimate sacrifice and for the betterment of Earth, because without Emeraldis, you wouldn't have the climax there, the proper ending there. She needs to live. So it's very interesting.
But it's interesting because you can really feel that most of this story, even if it picks bits and pieces from various works of Leiji Matsumoto, it was really written by Toei. Matsumoto reportedly was not that happy with. Of course, he was probably unhappy because that was not his pilot that was picked for the series. But he was not such a fan of what they were doing here. And it's interesting because, again, Dimensional Voyage, much later, picks some parts of Arcadia of my youth and reworks them to make them integrate better in the Leijiverse as Leiji sees it. It's interesting because that's the first case of Harlock being reinterpreted by someone else than Matsumoto. And Matsumoto has ambivalent feeling about it. And that happens again a few times. And the next big one is Endless Odyssey. So that's 2002. So it's like 20 years after Arcadia of my youth. And Endless Odyssey is interesting because Matsumoto, when he talks about it, or when he mentions it in interview, he always put some distance between himself and this series. He said that is Rintaro's version of Harlock. He was fine with letting Rintaro play with his character. They say, but that's not my Harlock. That's someone else took it for a spin, but it's not really part of my universe. And in fact, he actually stopped the production of the series because he saw some stuff that he was really against. And he said, no, don't do that. Stop it. Stop the presses.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an interesting story there, and I'm going to get into it a little bit. There was the usage of the Star of David for the antagonist. Now, this could be seen as it could be interpreted as very anti-Semitic. Now, we can also consider that other contemporary series like Neon Genesis Evangelion uses Christian imagery ad nauseum, but really the sentiment there in the production was this is just imagery. This is something we're latching onto because it's through the eyes of the Japanese and not necessarily, it's sort of an appropriation by the Japanese. It is used perhaps a little lackadaisical for somebody where Matsumoto might recognize it as an issue.
My understanding is that they were going for not the Star of David, but actually the alchemical symbol.
Right.
The two triangles, which is a symbol you see a lot in like alchemy and magic and demonology.
You see it in things like Reign the Conqueror, the Alexander the Great light novel that was adapted and character designs by Peter Chung. So a lot of historical and their philosophers are sort of leading a battle internally, and you see all that sort of imagery. So
on the topic of the Star of David and its use in Endless Odyssey, it was kind of used whenever they would go ahead and turn like the hands into dragons and use these isolated beams of fire to take people out. And I kind of see it less as the Star of David and more like the Keys of Solomon, where that's all entirely demonology, like Julien was saying, and it's based on taking these energies of damned souls and repurposing them. And that's entirely what the Keys of Solomon is. It's summoning demons and putting yourself into a different line of energy allocation. So when it comes to the Star of David, I don't see it as that so much.
I think that the intention of the people who are making the series, I really think they did not think of the Star of David at all. But Matsumoto, when he saw the scene, that's the first thing that came to mind, and he felt that it was really insensitive. So he put his veto on it, and the scene had to be redone and so on. So, but yeah, in general, you can see that Matsumoto, he did some interviews, he did promote the series and so on, but he was putting some distance and really insisting that that's not my character, that's someone else's interpretation of those characters, and you can see it in the way that Harlock in Endless Odyssey is a much darker version. You can see that he's a bit of a nihilist. Like, he wants to die. He wants to be killed by Daiba at the end.
Yeah, I mean, there's that patricide, right? There's that, and that's, again, that very mythological, and you know, there's Hebrew myth, there's Greek myth, and drawing from a lot of these different myths, because that is sort of the Leijiverse ethos is very mythological in nature, and having a bit of patricide in there, I guess, was the cherry on top for Rintaro, whatever he was trying to get across.
And
it's called an Odyssey for a reason.
Exactly, the Odyssey. There we go.
But yeah, it's and you get to that again in a way with the CGI movie, when you get the sense that it's the writers of the movie, I don't remember his name, went to how he saw Harlock.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
That's the CGI movie is not really an adaptation. I mean, it's not an adaptation of any specific story from Matsumoto. It picks bits and pieces from everywhere, including Daikaizoku Captain Harlock, as we were saying earlier. But it's really the writer's view or interpretation of the Leijiverse.
Right.
And again, Matsumoto was reportedly not happy with some of the choices and felt that they were betraying his characters. And and if the rumors are to be believed, he made the ending of the movie change, because in the original ending, Harlock was dying, and Logan or Yama was basically becoming Harlock. They changed it a bit in the final version, where you still get the sense that Yama is becoming Harlock, or a more heroic Harlock. But the previous Harlock does not die, because Matsumoto was like, "You're killing my character. What are you doing?" So you get the sense that these Harlocks are a bit like Harlock seen through a specific lens, and not really Matsumoto's Harlock, who is much more, at this point, a much more positive character. And I think it's very interesting, because Dimensional Voyage, which is the latest version of Harlock we have, where Matsumoto, he didn't write it himself. He approved everything. And actually, I had the chance to go visit Matsumoto a few years ago. And when we went to his home, so it's, the place with the giant Earth picture you see everywhere. So it was funny to be there. And he actually had a pile of pages, and it was the latest pages from Dimensional Voyage that he was going through and saying, no, change this, or this, I don't agree with this text. So even if he was not writing the manga himself, he was very involved in the story being told. And there's a few scenes in Dimensional Voyage that I find very interesting, because they try to correct course in a way. They pick stuff from these alternate interpretations of Harlock and bringing it back into the Leijiverse. So you have flashbacks referencing Arcadia of my youth, but it's not exactly as it is in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
You have the story of the golden goddess who appears at the end of Mugen Kido SSX, but she's turned into the queen of the photons, who is a very benevolent figure from Galaxy Express, the second cycle, and especially the novels that came after that. You see a mime clearly based on a design from the CGI movie, and being like able to control black matter and stuff like that. Stuff that you can imagine Matsumoto saw that and say, actually, this is cool, but not done like this. But I will keep this idea.
Yeah.
And there's a scene, and I don't want to spoil it, because read Dimensional Voyage, because I think it's a very nice way to enter this character, because it's more modern and everything. And it has an ending, which is a huge plus. But in the very end, there's a scene that's a clear answer to the ending of Endless Odyssey. And you can really feel like Matsumoto here is saying, if I take this scene, but do it my way, this is how it should go.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to spoil it again, but I found, reading it, I was like, whoa, it really feels like Matsumoto is directly answering this thing, saying, yeah, what the Harlock of Endless Odyssey does, I don't agree with it. My Harlock would do it that way.
Mm.
So yeah, but read it. It's a very cool manga.
Yeah, and one thing we don't have here in the notes, but perhaps to think about, is Jerome Alquier's Captain Harlock, who is also perhaps not as closely managed as Koichi Shimaboshi's version, but definitely approved of, noted on by Matsumoto in a similar way, and Matsumoto has, from all I've heard, spoken incredibly positively about Jerome's representation of that character. You know, we don't necessarily have to get too deep into his version unless you have something to say, Julien, but I will say, if you're listening to this before June 9th, in America, we're getting that very soon, courtesy of Ablaze Publishing. Please go out and support Jerome Alquier's new comic coming out of Captain Harlock, Memories de la Arcadia, as it was titled in France. Definitely something to think about as well, if you're interested in more Harlock.
And Jerome actually says that he was very, very, very surprised and appreciative of how warm and how encouraging Matsumoto was. From what I understand, Matsumoto asked for some changes, and he was still keeping an eye on things.
Sure.
But he was also very much like, you need to have fun. Like, do not treat my character like the gospel.
Yeah.
Have fun, have your own ideas, and it will show, and it will be enjoyable. So I think that's a very cool attitude from Matsumoto, and because he's really willing, even if he doesn't like Endless Odyssey, or is critical, maybe it's not that he doesn't like it, but he's critical of some aspects of it. He's still willing to let other people explore his characters and make their own spin of it. And that's I think that's a very, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but it's a very cool attitude nonetheless from Leiji.
Chad, isn't Endless Odyssey one of your go-tos? Isn't that one of your preferred representations of Harlock?
I really like certain facets of that version of Harlock.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the expansion of the universe, allowing these extra-dimensional creatures like New into it, it kind of brings something else to the table that other versions of Harlock didn't have. Like in Endless Odyssey, it goes ahead and has Harlock very jaded and bitter, and he wasn't going to get involved. And then New went to seek out the Arcadia, and it just pissed Harlock off. Just, okay, you could have gotten away with everything, but you went looking for the Arcadia, and just the fact that New, this god essentially, had to regret messing with Toshiro and Yeah, the Arcadia crew. It's like, I like that a god had to be afraid of, some drunkards.
Definitely. It's interesting.
It's basically Harlock punching Cthulhu.
Yeah,
exactly.
But it's also interesting that the otherworldly character, the sort of trans-dimensional character, takes on not an ambivalent or even a leading godlike figure, where you maybe more of an ambivalent in Space Battleship Yamato, maybe more of a leading godlike character in SSX, but then the trans-dimensional threat in Endless Odyssey being nude. I don't know if that was really ever explored by Matsumoto as the trans-dimensional, ethereal threat, Cthulhu, like you said. That's sort of that's interesting. I don't know if Matsumoto really ever did much like that, other than Endless Odyssey, which he disowned. So maybe that's not his view of another other dimensional character. Of a sort of
one thing we see a lot in Matsumoto, as early as Mirai's Ban, which we were mentioning earlier, is this idea that there's basically two universes. A universe of light, which is the one we are in, and the universe of darkness, which is its counterpart. And a lot of what we see in the recent works is done is the opposition of these two sides of these two universes. So it's very yin-yang kind of thing. And the metanoids, which appear in an early form in Mirai's Ban, but they are called the negas. So it's negativity, and they become the metanoids later, because he felt that that was a better name, probably, and they become the sort of glue antagonists that are behind everything in a way. So I don't necessarily say that's a good thing. I mean the metanoids, he's obsessed by it clearly, and he uses it as a plot device in a lot of work, and it kind of lacks a payoff. That's a bit of an issue with this plot. It happens in the novels, in the Galaxy Express novels, where there's an actual ending to this story. Yeah, that's basically Matsumoto's meta threat. That's why the metanoids come from. Is this idea that they are this dark side version of life coming for us, coming to extinguish the light. As I recall, the writer on Endless Odyssey was the writer of Perfect Blue. So I think that also explains why it's quite dark and a bit different in tone from what we used to.
Wow. Well, that was quite the adventure we went on. A Harlock-sized podcast adventure with some deep dives. I'm a little overloaded, so I think it's about time to sign off here. I'm Captain Hardluck. Julien, as our hopefully regular guest host here, do you have anything you'd like to plug, to share with the fans of the Leijiverse?
Sure. You asked me before if I wanted to plug something, but I wrote a pen and paper RPG called Lore and Legacy. It's nothing to do with Leiji Matsumoto. It's science fantasy, so that's a common theme.
Yeah.
And I just released it in English, actually. So
awesome.
If you want pen and paper RPG, curious, there's a free quick start guide if you want to just have a look at.
Where can they find that?
On the main platforms for RPGs in general, called Drive-Thru RPG. You search for Lore and Legacy, you will find it.
Lore and Legacy Drive-Thru RPG. Go check that out. And we interviewed Julien on Leijiverse before, and he actually made a homebrew tabletop version of Captain Harlock or the Leijiverse, which I'd love to get a chance to play that someday. So we'll see how things go. Chad, do you have any parting words for us? Anything you'd like to share?
Not exactly.
Go check out Captain Harlock and the Arcadia on Facebook. He's got some great memes there, at least, right?
Yeah, I got memes. I got laughs, yeah.
So go check it up there. And of course, if you're not following Leijiverse already, Check us out on facebook.com/Leijiverse, the world's largest English-speaking fan community for Leiji Matsumoto. Thank you for checking out the first episode of the Free Arcadia podcast. Thank you again so much. And I'm gonna hit you with that Harlock salute. And I'll talk to you all later.